Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar with the around conservation easement, from doing conservation easement monitoring from the air. My name is Ryan Boggs. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at LightHawk, and I'll be acting as kind of the MC for today, moving us through. Just a few housekeeping notes for the session today. This session is being recorded, and we will be making it available on our website in the near future as soon as we can get it up. We are muting everybody as you come online here, and we will be, if you have a question that you want to ask, we'll have some time at the end, but please put that in the chat down in the corner, and you can write any questions that you have, and then Audrey will help us get through those questions at the end of the program today. Let's see. So, a little bit about me. I know a lot of the folks here on the phone. It's cool to see so many familiar names. But my background is actually from the land trust world. I was executive director of a land trust here in Colorado for 4 years. So and actually got involved with LightHawk through my work at the land trust, doing both donor flights, board orientations, and easement monitoring in the air. And before that, I was with the Nature Conservancy for 9 years, and I'll never forget flying over my project area for the first time. It was one of those things where I had been working there for a long time, but seeing it really changed the way I thought about it. So the aerial perspective has always been incredibly valuable for me. We're doing this webinar today because we consistently get lots of questions about how to do conservation easement monitoring from the air, and we wanted to create a resource for all of our partners and pilots who get called upon to do this kind of work, a resource for them, and we wanted to have experts in the field help us with that, and that's why we've invited Jeremy Puckett and Bob Keller to speak to you today. Jeremy is the Stewardship Director for the Colorado Westland Trust, and he's been on 12 LightHawk flights. He's consistently noted that he is the most prepared passenger that the pilots ever get, as well as the most prepared partner that we work with. And that's why we asked him here today to share some of the things he does that makes the flights that he does so effective for both his land trust and for the pilot that he's working with. He also reports back great data for us. One of the things that is really important for LightHawk is that we know what happens because of a flight, and Jeremy has been able to document how many hours the flight has saved his organization, and has some great stories that has been helpful for us as we go out to raise our budget every year. And then after Jeremy, we're going to hear from Bob Keller, who's a LightHawk volunteer pilot. Bob joined LightHawk in 1994 after being one of the founders of Northern Wings, which was a LightHawk-like organization in the Northeast that later merged with LightHawk. Bob also is in the land trust world. He's the chair of the Tug Hill Tomorrow Land Trust, as well as a owner of a property that has a conservation easement on it. And Bob is from Boonville, New York. He's done numerous conservation easement monitoring flights as a pilot and as a land trust board member. So I'm going to pass this on to Jeremy. Jeremy, take it away.
All right. Make sure we got audio. It looks like we do. Thanks, Ryan. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the Colorado West Land Trust, why we fly, and then I'm going to kind of dive right into pre-flight planning, how I utilize GIS and select routes, and how I use Google Earth to do some visualization of the flights and of the properties that I monitor. We'll talk a little bit about the iFlight Planner and the LightHawk portal, how you go about setting a flight route up so that a pilot can access it, and how you can provide information to the pilots and to LightHawk when you're requesting a flight. And then finally, I'm going to just talk about executing the flight plan and how that works and some of the best practices in the air when you're working with a pilot. So I'll dive right in and start by saying that Colorado West Land Trust is a partnership between the Black Canyon Regional Land Trust and the Mesa Land Trust. Both were separate organizations operating in the same general geography. And about 3 years ago, we decided that we would be more efficient and have better outreach to our local communities and things like that if we combined forces and tried to operate as a single entity in this region. Between the two organizations, we have about 550 plus conservation easements. We cover an area of approximately 10,500 square miles in 6 counties on the west slope of Colorado. And we have about 123,000 acres under easement. So we have a very big service area, and we only have 2 full-time stewardship staff. And so we have determined that doing these conservation easement monitoring flights is a very effective way for us to cover our service area and to be more effective in our monitoring and stewardship activity. One other thing that I'll say is that we try to do monitoring flights in an alternating pattern. So LTA accreditation requires that you be on the ground at least once every 5 years in order to maintain your accreditation from a monitoring standpoint. We've determined that we like to try to be on the ground at least once every 3 years. And so we'll either fly properties a couple of consecutive years and then go out on the ground, or just alternate those properties on an annual basis. Some properties that are larger, we will often fly every year so that we can identify specific areas on the property that we might be interested in looking at, as opposed to making a huge ground monitoring site visit. All right, so why do we monitor from the air? As I said, we have 2 full-time staff at Colorado Westland Trust in the Stewardship Department, and so we both have around 250 to 300 properties that we need to visit every year. We do utilize contractors to monitor some of our properties on the ground, but flying is a very efficient way for us to monitor these properties. We try to keep good relations with our landowners, and by adding aerial monitoring into the mix, we can fly dozens of properties in a single flight that might take an hour and a half to 2 hours, where in some cases we have properties that are so far out afield from our office locations that we actually have to drive 3 hours or more to get to these properties. And so in the amount of time that we can fly, say, 3 dozen properties, we wouldn't even be able to reach a single property in some cases. So we typically will fly anywhere from 50, maybe up to 100 or so easements a year. And we've decided that we think it probably saves us anywhere from about $8,000 to $12,000 per year in time, contracting fees, mileage, all the things that go into monitoring these properties. So for us, it's a significant savings to be able to monitor in this fashion. Another thing that we really value, and one of the reasons that we fly, is because we feel like you can see a lot of the more interesting, intricate landscape dynamics from the air. And so by being able to fly and have the aerial perspective, we can see the big picture. And a good example of that would be, in some cases, we have beetle infestations in national forests that are near to conserved properties. And so we can kind of watch those dynamics of, the advancing beetle kill as it approaches conserved properties, or we can see development pressure around conserved properties and see how that may affect future management, or how we need to be prepared to work with landowners to watch for encroachment into the properties and things like that. So let's see, we'll go to the next slide and start with pre-flight planning. So my background is biology and GIS, and I use GIS extensively when I'm planning these flights. We maintain shapefiles for polygons and points for all of our conservation easements, and that is kind of the basis for how I go about planning flights. I try to identify clusters of easements that are close to one another, and select properties that can be effectively flown using this GIS method. And so I'll identify the properties. I will try to create these clusters and then create my routes so that I can either do a pass by multiple properties all at the same heading, or in the case of some properties, a large turn around those properties will create a good opportunity to see what we need to see. So as I'm planning, I try to limit unnecessary maneuvers and just kind of generalize the location of the points that I want to record for the flight plan that I'm going to give to the pilot. And this kind of cuts down on the clutter on the screen that they're looking at when they're doing navigation, and it helps to keep the flight plan a little bit cleaner on the pilot's end. I also try to plan for some gaps between the properties that I'm monitoring so that I have time to kind of collect my thoughts as I go from one cluster to the next. But one of the cool things about flying is that, again, maybe you don't have a target specifically identified on that particular leg of the flight, but if you overfly one of those properties, you can look down and even snap a few photographs as you go over it for a reference, or to share with the property owner if they're interested. And the other thing that I try to do is I try to allow a little bit of time between the takeoff point and the first property that we come to, and I'll get into that a little bit more later from the communication standpoint. Other things that you really need to kind of keep in mind as you're planning these flights is, you know, what side of the aircraft you're going to be on, where is the sun direction coming from in the morning or the afternoon. Is that going to cause glare in the window? Is it going to cause haze to appear more and thus kind of impact your photographs, make them a little bit fuzzier or a little bit washed out? You also need to be thinking about how you're going to coordinate your turns. Are you going to be on the right-hand side of the aircraft in the co-pilot position, and therefore you want all of the properties to be on the right-hand side of the flight plan, or are you going to coordinate your turns so that you can actually come into an area and then execute a turn and make that turn kind of all the way around a large cluster of properties and put yourself in position to be on the correct side of the aircraft for best viewing. So when I'm working in this GIS environment, I will usually take the point file that we have that's a centroid file, and I will do some manipulation to that so that I can create a flight sequence list so that I can keep track of the properties that I'm wanting to monitor. And this is not something that has to be shared with the pilot, but it can be, and it can be useful if they like to enter the waypoints into a GPS unit on the aircraft or something like that. So I will, as I select my properties, I'll give them a flight number, and then you can actually add latitude and longitude using the add XY function in ArcGIS to that point list. And the other thing is that sometimes it's a good idea to reproject your point file or whatever ahead of time, so that when you do that add XY, you end up with points in WGS 84 coordinate system, which is often utilized by pilots. The other thing I'll do is utilize a digital elevation model or a terrain model so that I can consider any terrain features that I might need to be aware of and talk to the pilot about. As I'm planning this route, if you need to execute a climb to get over a ridge, or if you don't want to climb in a particular area. The other thing is also if you have dangerous kind of quick changes in terrain, you want to be able to communicate that to the pilot. So you also want to limit the number of waypoints that you share. So you can kind of see on the right-hand side of that slide, there's an image that shows kind of a blocky flight pattern and a number of easements that you don't have direct lines to. And that's okay, because you want to be able to generalize the point that you're heading to, and then you can have a map that we'll talk about in a minute, like an Avenza GeoPDF, that you can actually look at as you're flying and make sure that you're getting around those properties where the pilot doesn't necessarily need to see that in the navigation software on his end. or her end. So let's see. So you want to create from this GP or GIS exercise, you want to create a GeoPDF map that you can load into a tablet or an iPhone or Android type application for situational awareness in the air. And I always export a KML file too, so that we can look at it in Google Earth. And then that's probably a good segue to the next slide. So I look at Google Earth to help identify prominent landmarks, whether they be patterns on the ground created from agricultural activity, or whether they be road intersections or actual structures. If in our case, we have a lot of irrigation ditches, or if you have ponds and rivers, you can use those as well. But using Google Earth is really effective because it allows you to set the eye point elevation. And if you are familiar with Google Earth, you can look down in the right-hand corner and you can see that eye point elevation, and that roughly corresponds to your above ground level elevation when you're flying. And so you can set Google Earth up so that your viewing of a property is very similar to what you would see from the air, and it allows you to consider the best approach or the best orbit around a property so that you can actually see what you need. Keeps you from having to guess as much when you're in the air. If you know, hey, I want to be looking for that lake or that pond, or I want to be looking for a specific intersection. It also allows you to see those adjacent property relationships so you can see what's going on, almost as if you are flying the airplane. And so I kind of use it as a run through as well to make sure that my flight plan makes sense and I can think about that ahead of time. You can also print hard copies of those Google Earth shots if there are difficulties that you think you might encounter, and use those in the aircraft either on a clipboard or on an e-board or something like that so that you can have a reference point. The last thing that we'll talk about here is the iFlight Planner for planning. You've got your web interface. You can kind of compare your GIS using aerial imagery and this iFlight Planner. You can look at the satellite imagery, or you can look at street type mapping and select points that correspond to the flight plan that you've generated in GIS. And what I generally do is you start at the airport location that you know you're going to be taking off from, and click a point there, and you can select that airport as your initial point location. And then you build your flight plan out in sequence from the original takeoff location to the first waypoint, second waypoint, all the way around. And that's going to create a list that the pilot can then use to export and import into like a ForeFlight tablet application, or in some cases I would imagine they can import that directly into their avionics navigation software in the aircraft, and then use that to help them maintain situational awareness in the air. You can also set the speed that you anticipate flying at in this iFlight Planner application, and that allows you to get an idea of how much time you're going to spend in the air, which is an important element of the LightHawk application process for the request for the flight. So once you've got your whole flight plan kind of set up in iFlight Planner, you can actually bookmark that flight plan and come back to it later if you want to, or you can just grab that URL and dump it into your LightHawk flight plan. But one of the good things here also is that the pilots can utilize this flight plan to look at an aeronautical chart and actually see what types of information they may need to be certain that they're operating in a safe manner. If they have controlled airspace that they have to deal with, or if they have special operations like hang glider operations, or I guess skydiving in some cases, you'll see that on the chart. You can see things like communications towers or power lines and other flight routes where there might be significant potential for encountering traffic along the way. So that's an important element for the pilots to be able to access as well. So then The LightHawk portal itself is a very good resource, and all of this, the links for these resources are available from LightHawk. Generally, when you're using the portal, the main thing that you need to be aware of is that you have to draft an explanation of the flight, why you're doing it, what the purpose is, the justification, identify the number of partners or passengers that you plan to have on the flight, your preferred dates, and plug in this iFlight route for the pilot. And I just like to think that the better the justification you can provide for the flight, the more likely you're going to get interest from the volunteer pilots and have options for executing your flight. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So executing the flight plan, kind of where the rubber hits the road, except you're not on the ground. So communication and situational awareness is absolutely the key to having a successful flight. So I start off all of my flights with a pre-flight briefing with the pilot, talking about the information that I've created in the GIS environment, my awareness of potential challenges along the route or complicated turn procedures that I've imagined that we're going to be doing. Talking about the terrain hazards that you think you might encounter and letting the pilot know that they have the option to modify the route at their discretion, and that you're prepared to adapt to what they need to do to make sure that you have a safe flight. This opportunity to talk prior to the flight is also a really good way to build rapport with the pilot, so that once you're in the air, you're not as apprehensive about communicating. And that is very helpful, because as soon as you get off the ground, you guys are working in a partnership to make sure that you get what you need. So prior to taxiing and engine start and all that, it's good to have your stuff organized and kind of be visualizing your first waypoint that you're going to be traveling to, kind of imagining that you're setting up for success as soon as you get off the ground. But one thing that's important also is that when you are in that environment at the airport and also nearby the airport, you need to allow the pilot to either communicate with the tower if there's a towered airport, or with other traffic that might be in the area, and allow them a little bit of time to configure the aircraft so that they're either climbing or cruising safely before you start to try to interact with them. But once you're kind of at that point and their workload has decreased, you can begin talking about things like the correct altitude, the correct speed that you want to be operating at. You may have to do a little bit of maneuvering to get back onto your flight plan. So things happen quickly once you're in the air. You need to begin kind of pointing out landmarks to your pilot and saying, you know, see that barn over there, or see that reservoir over there. That's kind of where I need to be headed. And so you begin talking and sharing this information, so that once you arrive at your first waypoint, you're able to identify the landmarks that are going to be most useful for initiating your turns, or any type of maneuvering that you're going to need to be able to do in order to see the property as best as you can. So try to stay ahead of the airplane, and feel free to communicate with your pilot. You have to work together to make it work. And the more information you can share and the more calmly you can do that, you're gonna have a better flight. So the other thing here is using the Avenza app. On the right-hand side of this screen, you can see there's a blue dot in the middle in that map that I showed you earlier. That Avenza app is going to track where your location is, and you can use a cell phone or a tablet that has a cellular chip in it. You don't have to have a cell connection, but you would need to have some type of either location services enabled, or if it doesn't have a cellular chip, you would want to have like a bad ELF device or some other type of external GPS that the Avenza app can access for location purposes. But you can see your progress across the ground, and you can see your relationship to these properties in the air, and know whether or not you're turning widely enough to capture everything you want, or if you're on the right heading to intersect that property the way that you want to. So you can share these things with the pilot, like, oh, hey, I need to turn maybe 5 degrees left or 5 degrees right or whatever as you're approaching these properties. And that will help them and help you get what you need. And then the last thing about communication to really say is that if you miss something, or if you are concerned that you're losing your awareness or your mental focus, you can also ask the pilot to kind of turn out of the flight path for a second and loiter a little bit so that you can regain your composure and get focused again and get back on the flight path and continue collecting what information you need. So let's go ahead and move to the next one. All right, so how do you ensure success? You kind of have to know ahead of time what it is that you need. Are you going to need overview photos, or are you needing detail photos? The two photos that you have on this page show an example of kind of an overview on the left, where you're doing a wide orbit around a property looking for general disturbance or information related to management of the property. On the right-hand side, that's a tighter turn over a residential building envelope where you've got activity taking place, and maybe you need to see whether a new structure has been created. In this case, I was looking for a couple of solar panel arrays that had been developed just to the right and above where the white roofed house is. And so, I was trying to get a tighter shot looking at that. So the type of information that you need is going to help you prepare for the flight. Also, knowing whether you need to have coordinated data, whether you need like a flight track log, if you need to be able to capture the time that your photograph was taken so that you can correspond that back to your images, and know that you're looking at the right images. You might need to manually capture the time on your flight list so that you can say, this was the time on station, this is the photograph that corresponds to that property. It's also going to inform things like, how fast are you flying? How high above the ground are you flying? And so typically I fly anywhere from 80 to 100 knots, maybe sometimes as fast as 115 or so when I'm maneuvering around properties. It's generally a safe speed, and it gives you time to look at what you want to see. Altitude level is often anywhere from 500 to 1,000 feet above ground level. And that's, again, is generally a safe speed as long as the pilot is comfortable with that, or a safe altitude as long as the pilot is comfortable with that. And they're aware of any, obstructions like towers or terrain that they need to be monitoring while they're performing these maneuvers. So let's see. The pilot is going to let you know if you ask them to do something that they can't do. They're going to be pretty quick to say, I can't quite do that, or we're going to have to circle up to get over that ridge, or we can't do that, we need to go this direction instead. And you kind of have to be prepared to adapt to that and work with the pilot again to meet your needs. And let's see. I guess the one final thing that I'll say is, I like to wear dark colors in the cockpit because they don't reflect off of the windows as much, and that can be an issue. But dress comfortably, take a couple of layers. Sometimes it's warmer in the aircraft because of the light coming in the windows and the lack of air conditioning or ventilation. So you might want to take something off, you might want to put something on. And breathe. Like if you're flying and you begin to get kind of nervous, or if you begin to feel like you're getting stressed out, just remember to breathe. Tell the pilot, hey, can we slow down, or can we take a moment to recoup and move along. So with that, I'll wrap it up and pass it back to Ryan, and we'll follow up with questions at the end if we need to.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. All you partners out there, I think Jeremy just raised the bar a lot for you on how he does this, and there's a number of pilots on this that are probably going to have high expectations, but we had several questions about whether or not this was going to be provided, the materials were going to be provided, and we will be making this webinar available on our website, as well as some written documentation around this. That's one of our goals, is to have better information for partners as you go through these. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm going to pass this over to Bob, and Bob is going to talk about easement monitoring from the air from the perspective of a pilot, as well as some of the things he's learned with his land trust work. Take it away, Bob.
Okay, thank you. And Jeremy did a great job covering GIS and route selection, and especially pilot issues. I can really see why pilots enjoy flying with him. I'll just quickly add that pilots, as he mentioned, will often make minor adjustments to the route to improve overall efficiencies, maybe based on conditions. But, don't worry, we'll be sure to cover all your waypoints, assuming conditions continue to permit that during the flight. Now let's get started by before the flight. And as a pilot, I always like to check in with the lead person, the lead partner person, before the flight, 3-4 days in advance. Like to talk about the weather outlook, what they feel their weather requirements are for the flight. If they're going to be taking photos, I'd like to know what type of equipment they might be using. Is open window required? And my experience there is, by the way, that in most circumstances, unless you're doing professional quality photos for publication, shooting through the windows of an airplane is fine. Open windows aren't always needed, and can be add to some of the not complications, but it's a little different issue when the window is open. Another thing I ask about is, what are the passengers' previous experience in light airplanes? Have they been up before? Did they enjoy it? If they haven't been up in light planes, are they comfortable in small boats in rough water? I mean, I try to get a sense of what their tolerance is for, being a little bumped around. Even on a smooth day, an airplane's gonna, be moving around a little bit. So I like to get a sense of that. And Jeremy alluded to this, the temperature in the airplane. I like to mention to them that can vary widely. It can be really hot sitting on the ramp on a sunny day, and once you get up to altitude, it can be 40, 50, 60 degrees colder. So you sort of have to be able to dress for those changes somewhat. I try to keep the airplane cockpit a little bit on the cool side. Just because I feel that it's just better for everyone to be alert. Sometimes a warm, stuffy cabin can lead to feeling uncomfortable, maybe feeling a little sick. But anyway, I like to cover all those things, get a good sort of sense of who I'll be flying with and what I'll be doing. The next thing is at the FBO. FBO is the fixed base operator that's at the airport the day of the flight. And that's an opportunity to review the objectives of the mission and what the weather is. We should by then, everybody should know what we're trying to do, but just to review that, make sure we're all on the same page. It's also where I start my pre-flight briefing. And some of the things I like to cover there are traffic, which is other airplanes, and birds specifically. If I tell my passengers, if they see those looking out the window, point them out to me. I've probably seen them. It's probably not an issue, but it's always good to make sure the pilot's aware of anything you see. Another thing I'll mention is that if the passengers see anything that concerns them, it might be a caution light on the panel, or a gauge they think, well, why is that gauge reading this? Shouldn't it be reading that? Anything that might concern them, please ask. I'd rather not have my passengers wondering if there's some sort of impending doom in the offing there. It's usually nothing. For instance, on my plane, after we've been flying a while, if we do a lot of circling, I'll often get a caution light for low fuel in the wing that's been high as we're turning. So it's not a big deal, but please ask. It's better that the passengers feel comfortable and know that, oh, that's no big deal. It's nothing at all. Now something I call Lady Garmin. Most planes today have some sort of advanced avionics with GPS, which gives terrain and traffic warnings. And in my plane, it's all Garmin. So it's Lady Garmin who will tell me if there's terrain ahead or if she sees an airplane. And it's better that the passengers know not to be alarmed if all of a sudden they hear this voice saying, terrain, pull up, pull up. It can be a little disconcerting. If it gets a little annoying, we just turn off the audio portion of that safety feature. We always leave the visual on. But sometimes on these flights, you are working closer to higher terrain. You're, maybe in a valley nearby hills. So we do turn it off. Another thing I'll mention when you're walking out to the airplane, to be careful. Stay with your pilot when you're walking out to the plane. Don't go wandering off on the ramp. You never know when a plane, the engine might start, or there might be some sort of movement you're not aware of. So safety first, always stick with the pilot. And also in today's security environment, you might wander in an area where they don't want you, and that's not good. Also, before we get in the plane, it's really our last chance to ask questions. If they've got some questions about anything about the flight, the plane, the weather, anything, it's a good chance to go over those before you're in the plane. So the next thing is in the plane. Once we get out on the ramp area and we're in the plane, is the time to do the second half of the pre-flight briefing. One of the things to cover there is headsets. We'll always have headsets for the passengers. The headsets, almost all of them should have individual volume adjustment. So different passengers can adjust the volume, and actually usually on many of them you can adjust left or right volume too. The other thing to go over is positioning the mic. These mics require that they be placed directly in front of your mouth. They're almost like kissing the mic. If it's a few inches away, we won't hear what you're trying to say. So we'll cover headsets. We'll also point out things in the plane and how they operate. There's some things like vents, air vents and whatnot that'd be appropriate for passengers to adjust during the plane or during the flight. But there will be other things that it's not appropriate to touch or adjust. So I like to go over with the things, especially that I don't want you to touch. Airplanes have something called a mixture control. It's usually has a red knob at the end of it. There's some other things like that if you start playing with them, it's not good. So we want to make sure we go over those things before we start the engine. And something else in aviation is something called Sterile Cockpit. And essentially that's trying to eliminate unnecessary talking. And this is most important during the taxi from the ramp to prior to takeoff, and departure when you're out on the runway taking off and climbing out, and also during arrival. Now, passengers can usually talk to each other, and I can even isolate them so I don't even hear them talking to each other on the headset, so I can just hear air traffic control. That's not always possible, but it's never a good idea to, unless it's important, it's never a good idea to start asking the pilot questions as you're rolling down the runway, like, oh, what's that plane over there? We want our pilots to be focusing on flying the plane. So, it's, as was mentioned, once we get up to altitude, fine, then we can have a more general communications back and forth with the pilot. Another thing I'll say before we start the engines take off is get your stuff organized. Figure out where you want your everything you brought onto the plane so it's easily accessible. You don't want to find out half an hour into the flight you can't reach something that you needed. So make sure that's all organized. Our next thing, next area is once we're up in the plane, once we're flying. For the pilots, the most important thing to remember is fly the plane. You'll have these folks in the plane with you and they're trying to, accomplish a certain mission and they'll be talking amongst themselves, but the pilot's most important thing is to fly the plane. And for the pilot also situational awareness. And here we're talking about as pilots know, where are you in regards to your terrain? What's the weather looking like in the distance and even closer to you, and also airspace. I've done flights closer to large cities where there's some very complicated airspace, and as pilots, we do not want to, what they call, bust into airspace we're not supposed to be in. So the pilots have to maintain situational awareness, and this might mean, ignoring their passengers for a minute or two while they're making sure they've got everything under control as to where they are. As I said, that's especially true in complicated airspace around big cities. And during the flight, it's a good idea for pilots to remember to check with their passengers. Are we accomplishing the mission objectives? Are we getting you where you need to be? Are you seeing what you need? Everything working out well? But also the passenger's personal needs. One thing to me, I notice if a passenger gets very, very quiet and they've been sort of a little talkative before, it probably means they're not feeling too well. So actually, before we take off, I mentioned where the 6 sacks are. I have one or two for every seat position, and I like to mention that. So, but check on your passengers. How's the temperature in the plane? Are they a little warm? Are they a little cold? Are they feeling a little queasy? Make sure they're doing well. During the flight, for the partner, I would suggest keep the pilot informed of any of your needs, concerns, or problems. In other words, first by needs, I mean, do you need to be a little higher, a little lower, off to the left, to the right, whatever, a tighter turn? Let the pilot know. And concerns, again, that might be maybe there's some issues during the flight. You're not seeing some of the things you wanted to see, or there's some other issue. Let the pilot know. Maybe this is something that's easily resolved. Or if you're having a problem, if you've got some technological problem, let the pilot know, as was mentioned, we can break off from the track while we get those sorted out and then fly back over the waypoints again, rather than go flying around waypoints and you're not accomplishing what you need to do because of some issue. So keep the pilot informed. Another thing I'll mention here is ask. Everything's well planned, but if you've got an idea about something else during the flight, or you're finishing up a little earlier and you'd really like to see something over the next ridge or wherever it might be, just ask the pilot. Many times we have more than enough fuel, and the time we can easily adjust routes, we can add waypoints, we can go look at something else. Again, the pilot will have to assess the weather and other considerations. But if everything is looking good, just ask. Best practices for partners. I would say know your tech before you get in the airplane. In other words, know how the equipment you're bringing with you, the iPads, the GPSs and everything, know how they work, know how they're going to interface with each other. Getting in the airplane is not the time to figure out or to be trying to explain to your colleague in the back seat how something's supposed to work. Get that all figured out in advance. Remember your battery backups. Nothing worse than maybe even data cards if needed, but you don't want to be up there and all of a sudden have battery die or something. Even for iPads and things like that, you can bring little backup, battery backup supplies, power supplies. And by the way, I have yet to know a GA pilot that is concerned about people using iPads and other things in the aircraft. So we're not the airlines. You can use that stuff. Best practices also include being organized. If you're bringing folders, maps, cords, things like that, try to be as organized as possible. So when you get in the plane, everything's where you want it, easily accessible. And know your team coordination. Don't try and figure out who's going to do what once you're in the airplane. There can always be adjustments, but have a good idea of each person's role before you're in the plane. And as I mentioned before, keep the pilot informed. When I'm flying along, if you see that the wind is blowing us over the easement you want to look at, just mention that you want me a little farther to the left or to the right, or fly past the end of that pond before starting the turn. Just keep me informed and keep your pilot informed. It'll work out well. What not to do. Do not open a window without asking. Even if you're planning to open the window during the flight and you've been briefed beforehand how to do it, do not do it till the pilot says it's okay. Oftentimes, we might be flying too fast for the window to be open safely, or might be some other issue. Let the pilot know when he says it's fine. If you're opening the window, go ahead. The other thing is, do not adjust something in the plane if you're not sure how to do it or if it's okay. So if he's explained to you how to or change an air vent, fine. But if you think this dial or on the panel will adjust the volume, don't go start tweaking a volume. It says volume, so don't start turning that. You might be turning down his volume, the pilot's volume, to talk to air traffic control. So just don't adjust or touch things without asking. And don't assume that this flight is the same as a prior flight. You might have been up a number of times and you think, oh, I'm going up with a 182 again. I know how everything works there. I can just go ahead and do this or that in the airplane. It's not a problem. If you're flying with a new pilot, each pilot has their own procedures, the way they want things done. So don't assume anything, especially if you're flying with a new pilot or the same pilot, but he's got a different airplane. 182s have been built for 30 plus years. There's some differences between the older ones and the newer ones. So just remember, and as I said, don't assume anything. Let's see. As I said, always ask the pilots first before you're doing things. That should pretty much be it. After the flight's completed and we're back on the ground, it is important to let the program director know that the mission is complete. For pilots, I usually just shoot a text to Audrey, let her know that I'm back on the ground. I usually text her also before I take off to start the mission. And even the partners, it's a good idea to text or email your program director just to give them a preliminary, hey, everything went well, it was a good flight. And the other thing to remember is the mission report, or call it an after action report, whatever you want. For pilots, it's pretty straightforward. We'll get a link on the pilot portal for LightHawk, and we go in and enter our the number of hours flown and the hours of preparation before the flight. And for the partners, there's usually a report request from each of the passengers. It's a little more detailed. LightHawk likes to know how things went, etc. But I think that pretty much covers it, and I'll turn this back over to Ryan.
Great, thanks, Bob. I think you guys can all see why we asked both Bob and Jeremy to help us out today. Audrey, do we have any questions that have come in the chat at this point?
We do not yet, but I did just post a message in the chat for anybody to, if a question has occurred to you throughout the presentation, please type it in there and we'll kind of go through one by one and ask those questions. And while I kind of give you guys all time to get your thoughts in order, I just prepared a few questions to ask the presenters. So let's see, first of all, maybe just kind of a general question to both Jeremy and Bob. What's the ideal length of an easement monitoring flight from your perspective?
Okay. Most of our flights are anywhere from around an hour to 2 hours. And I would say an hour and a half is very typical. Any longer than 2 hours and you've begun to accumulate so much information, I feel that you might begin to forget, you know, what it is that you need to do to finish the flight. Like if I've already photographed 35 properties and I still have 15 to go, sometimes I get a little bit sloppy towards the end of the flight.
Yeah, I would just say, yeah, that's good advice. From the pilot's perspective, these flights can sometimes be a little, you know, you're doing a lot of turning and whatnot. So yeah, after a couple hours, I usually don't mind landing. However, you know, if I'm flying with a partner that's trying to get a lot done and they want to keep going, usually, you know, 3 hours is a long flight. But again, in some situations, it might be the easements are quite far apart. It's, you know, they're covering a lot of, not necessarily a lot of easements, but there's far apart. So you're doing some just basically flying straight and level, and that's pretty relaxing. So it really depends about the intensity of the flight, I think, is the big thing. But if it's a new partner for doing this, err on the side of a shorter flight than a longer flight until you get a handle of how it works for you.
Great. And we have a few more questions coming in now. The first one's from Anya Byers of the Nature Conservancy. And it looks like this question is for Jeremy. Do you count your pre-work flight planning when you calculate the time the flights have saved? Or are you just counting time in the air versus time on the ground?
That's a good question. You know, I think that when I have calculated the time, I generally think of it in terms of the field time that's saved. There is a fair amount of time that goes into the front end preparation, and I would say, depending on the complexity of the flight or the number of times that you've flown some of the similar routes and things like that, the workload or the planning load goes down over time. But it can easily take, I would say, up to 3 or 4 days worth of time to plan all of the flights that I need to do in a year. And we typically fly maybe 3 to 4 flights a year.
Okay, great, thank you. Second question is from Derek Ellis of the Jackson Hole Land Trust. Could you please address the advantages of flight monitoring over analyzing fixed aerial imagery?
Okay. You know, fixed aerial imagery, the difficulty there is that you can't always be sure when it was taken. You know, I use NAPE imagery, which is National Agricultural Imagery Program, I believe. At any rate, it's kind of the base mapping type imagery that we use for a lot of our field maps and things like that, but it's only updated every 2 years if you're lucky. And sometimes you can't be sure that it's flown during the same season or that it's even going to be released to the public in a timely manner. So what I have found is that imagery, dedicated imagery, is too expensive. And so that's an advantage of using LightHawk. The other is that you can actually focus on specific features of the landscape if you want to. You can, like I've said, with these larger properties that we have, you can use that aerial image or the satellite imagery to look at a whole property. But say you want to look at a specific area that looks like maybe there's been some gravel mining occurring, or if you've got oil and gas activity on the edge of a property and you're concerned that maybe it's encroaching into the conservation area, you can actually fly low enough that you can see the activity on the ground taking place. You can make sure that you're using a camera that has high enough resolution that you can zoom into those photographs maybe significantly more than 1 meter resolution NAPE imagery would allow. And so you have a lot better detail, and you have assurance that you know when that imagery was taken and that you've captured all of the features of that particular landscape that you want to.
Fantastic,
Yeah.
thank you.
I'll just add there at our land trust, you know, from my experience as pilot and also at our land trust, that, you know, the aerial monitoring is it's a different experience than just looking at maps in your office. One thing is when you're doing the flying, you see the adjoining properties. You get a sense of, oh, wow, look at that thing over there. I didn't realize that was happening there. That might impact on our conserved property. Might want to pay attention to that. Also, let's say you're flying after a lot of rain. You might see on your conserved property, wow, I didn't realize we'd have a flooding issue there or something. So, and sometimes you see people out on the property, you know, what's that piece of equipment doing there today? You know, it gives you a chance to see it in real time. So there are advantages to that we find valuable at our land trust.
Great. And I did just want to mention
more on that one.
Yeah.
There are land trusts who built up monitoring protocols that include both aerial or remote sensed imagery. Aspen Valley Land Trust had done that, and then combine that with aerial monitoring from an airplane, and then on the ground visits where they try to hit each property with one of those methods every 3 years. And that was at least when we were working with them. So it can, the aerial imagery can be a really valuable tool, but it's a complementary to the suite of things, I would say.
Great.
One other thing I would add to that is that it can be a really good opportunity to take additional people who may not be affiliated with the stewardship aspect along for a flight. So maybe your major donor outreach people, or maybe a new employee who is getting used to a landscape, that can provide an opportunity for them to see some of the landscape from a different perspective as well.
Fantastic.
I'll quickly add there though, if it's an easement monitoring flight and that's your objective, vet whoever you're bringing. You don't want to be partway through an easement monitoring flight and have that donor or something tell you they're feeling sick and would like to go back. So
This is true.
And from a pilot's point of view too, you know, we're there to do a mission. We don't want, you know, someone messing it up, and you folks don't either. So keep that in mind.
Great, and I do recognize that we're going just a bit over time here. We have 2 more questions. If you do have to leave, we will continue recording during the question and answer session. And if there are any additional questions, I'm going to go ahead and type my email into the chat, so you can go ahead and forward those to me, and I will get those to the 2 presenters and get an answer to you. So let's see, we have Deborah Mitchell, who is with ARI. It's an artist in residence program out of Everglades National Park. And she asks, can we please chat a bit more about the Avenza app mentioned earlier? Is that something that we download as a pre-flight planning tool?
Okay, so Avenza is offered both in a free version and a paid version, and there are tiered pricing rates for nonprofit organizations versus commercial use. It's essentially an application for tablet or phone that allows you to upload maps that are geo-referenced. In my case, I make my own maps using ArcGIS and create GeoPDF type maps with the flight plan route depicted and the easements depicted. You could do this for an individual property if you had a specific target, but you can also create a larger map like I do. So I store my maps in Dropbox, and there's a way to directly import the maps that are stored in Dropbox. There are also other cloud-based storage systems that you can upload these maps from. In some cases, I've been able to load a map directly from an email attachment into Avenza. And what it does is it basically uses that cell phone chip, which is GPS enabled, or if you don't have a cellular capable device like an iPad that only uses Wi-Fi, you can use a Bluetooth or direct type of plug-in external GPS unit to create that spatial awareness for that device. And then Avenza just accesses that particular location service device, like the bad elf. And so then it will do what you typically see with any other phone type app, mapping app. It will put a point on the map where your location is. And as you follow your flight plan, that point will move across the map that you've created. You can zoom in and out of that map so that you can kind of get a better idea of where you are in relation to a particular property boundary or other features on the landscape. It does pixelate, and there is a little bit of limited zooming capability for those maps. So if you need high resolution, you should probably import a map that is more specific. I create a map that has my whole flight route on it so that I can see generally where I am in relation to those. But it's a very useful tool, and I think the free version only allows you to import 3 maps at a time, whereas the paid versions, you can load any number of maps. So say you had a whole bunch of properties that you wanted detailed maps of, you could load all of those maps into the paid version and load them individually and see in very high detail where you were in relation to that property.
Great. Thank you. And then we have a final question from Janet Britt of the Agricultural Stewardship Association. And this question is for Jeremy. She says, do you fly all during the year? We try to go post-leaf fall, but before too much snow cover.
We typically fly in the summer months. Because I'm in Western Colorado, we have a lot of elevational gradient in our service area. So we have a lot of snow on the ground in some areas up through the middle of May sometimes. This year, we still have snow on the ground, and we're still getting snow at high elevations. So we will often begin flying in late May, and we will continue flying through sometimes August, late August. But we also don't have as much deciduous vegetation out here that would obstruct our view of features on the ground. And so that is not as much of a problem for me as it might be in, say, the Northeast or the Southeast, where you have a lot more deciduous vegetation and you might want to fly when you've got leaf off.
I'll just add, from the perspective of living in the Northeast here, I agree. Ideally for easement monitoring, you want it after leaf off before you get much snow cover. The picture that's showing up on my screen anyway now of farmland in the upper Connecticut River Valley, you can see there's a little bit of snow on the ground, not much, but you can see the corn stubble through some of those farm fields. You can see where they've been spreading manure on some fields. A little bit of snow in the fall or late fall, early winter doesn't necessarily shut you down. So don't be concerned about that. And you can also fly in the spring. When we flew in New Hampshire for the Forest Society there, we did all of it in the spring. We would do it started in the southern part of the state and worked our way to the Canadian border. And again, once the snow is pretty much gone, but before leaf out, and it works fine. So.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you, Bob and Jeremy. Appreciate your time today and sharing your expertise with all of our partners and pilots that joined us. We focused on conservation easement monitoring today, but one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that that conservation easement monitoring is just one of the things that LightHawk can help you with in your work. At the very beginning, I mentioned that I did board orientations and major donor flights that were really helpful for my land trust. And if you're interested in working with us on conservation easements or any other thing that we can help you with, Audrey just posted 2 email addresses for Esther Duke and Jonathan Milne, who are Eastern and Western program directors, in the chat. And you can feel free to get in touch with them, or if you want to, you can just go to our website, lighthawk.org. And there's a link that says become a partner, I believe, and you can fill out a little form there, and that will route you to the right person, and they will get in touch with you about how to become a partner. Like we talked about, we are going to post this webinar on our website in the next few days. And also you'll be getting an evaluation from us, and we'd really appreciate any feedback that you have about this webinar. This is our first one that was a technical webinar. We've done webinars around some of our projects before, but this is kind of a hard skills thing. And we're guessing at what you want to know. And so any feedback about what you actually want to know will be really helpful for planning these things in the future. Again, thanks to Jeremy and Bob, and we'll sign off. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.